Ever since trucks were first invented in the early 1900s, there has been some form of free labor or free time expected from truck drivers. This video is sponsored by DriveWise. A big part of why the Teamsters were formed in the early 1900s was because of all the free labor and time truck drivers were expected to put in. Teamsters back then, the early Teamsters, were expected to lift and hand bomb their loads on and off, and it didn't matter how much the stuff weighed, whatever it was. That was the truck driver's job. It was unpaid, and that's part of what started the formation of the Teamster. In the 1980s, years and years later, I was expected, and I did it. I hand bombed all my own loads off and onto my reefer trailer. And when you'd complain about something like that to the shipper, he'd say, well, you know, it's built into the rate. And that was the standard line back then. Everything was built into the rate. It was just horse crap, because it really wasn't. But if you didn't do it, if you didn't hand bomb on and hand bomb off, you just didn't get the load and you drove away empty. Today, most of the unpaid labor or time seems to be in the form of unpaid waiting time. Now, when I started trucking in the 70s, we never really had that problem. In the 70s and even in the 80s, when you bumped the dock, you started loading or unloading. And it didn't come to be until the 90s, until the big grocery chains and the auto plants decided they wanted appointment times, and you got into long periods of waiting if you got to one of these warehouses early. And sometimes even when you were on time for your appointment, if they were running behind, you had to sit and wait. But that's only been a recent problem, only since the 1990s or so. But since the 90s, the waiting time, expected waiting time, free time, has gotten longer and longer and longer. And it doesn't only just affect owner-operators, who really can't do a whole lot about it other than reject the load. It's even affecting company drivers. So if you're a company driver for a fleet, or a unionized driver, that wasn't really a problem. But for the majority of truck drivers, that was just eaten time, free time, gone out of their work week. And they hated that. Everyone was paid by the mile. The more they sat, the fewer miles they could get in. It was costing them money at the end of the week. One of the most stressful parts of any truck driver's day is getting pulled around into the scales. DriveWise eliminates that stress with their bypass scale technology. It works on all major ELDs or on your cell phone. Check them out at drivewise.com. By the mid-1990s, truck drivers were moving away from being upper middle income earners to lower income earners, and a lot of it had to do with this waiting time. And everyone was complaining, but even the carriers were scared to go to the customers and start charging waiting time, because everybody was afraid of losing a customer, especially the mega carriers. They didn't want to lose a customer to just another mega fleet. And that's what was happening off the time, because the cheapest guy would get the bid for the big freight. So even carriers were afraid to approach the subject and then pay their drivers. Today, detention time or waiting time has gotten so bad that some of the big carriers have had to step into the breach, go to their customers and say, you know what, this guy was 10 hours at the dock. You've got to give us some money for that. And the carriers called it detention time. For the most part, shippers and receivers now could see that that was becoming a problem, and they started to pay money for that waiting time to the carriers. But a lot of that money that they called detention time did not filter down to the truck drivers. The carriers just pocketed the money. Today, the large majority of truck drivers in the United States remain low-income workers. Now that detention time is starting to improve. They've upped the driver's rate, the mileage rate, to try to compensate the driver. And truck drivers now are starting to make better money than they did 10 years ago, because a lot of companies are stepping forward with this detention pay. We recently did a poll, and it was encouraging to see the results. 65% of truck drivers reporting into the poll said that they got paid for all of their work. Now, that was still leaving another 35% doing unpaid work, but the numbers were better than I expected. They're improving. I'd like to see that trend continue. Perhaps it will, because truly the numbers should be 100% of truck drivers paid for all the work that they do. Bottom line here, with today's ELD technology, the carriers know every minute that their drivers and owner-operators spend at customers' docks. With this electronic tracking system, there is absolutely no excuse for carriers not to charge the shippers and receivers for that waiting time because they know it down to the minute. The mega carriers still refuse to do this because they want to keep the money for themselves, but the good carriers out there are now paying drivers for all of their time. Those are the carriers you want to work for, period. Stay safe, keep the rubber side down. The next issue we have to tackle is why overtime isn't paid to company drivers. Keep the rubber side down. I'll see you on the backhaul.